In her award-winning book, After the Crime, The Power of Restorative Justice Dialogues Between Victims and Violent Offenders, Professor Susan L. Miller examines actual dialogues that occurred between victims of violent crimes and their offenders. As outlined in the book, these dialogues occurred as part of a restorative justice program known as Victims' Voices Heard, which is based in the state of Delaware. As a reminder, the way this program works is that whenever someone has been the victim of a crime, he or she can contact this organization, and a face-to-face meeting between the victim and offender can occur, providing, of course, that both parties are willing and that the victim is not too angry. Also, it must be evident that the offender accepts responsibility and is willing to make amends. In all of the cases that Miller examines, the offender had already been tried and convicted prior to meeting with the victim. In the first few chapters of the book, Miller analyzes two violent crimes involving strangers. But we know that a disproportionate amount of violence occurs within the family. So this begs the question, are restorative justice dialogues appropriate in cases of family violence? The answer, according to Miller, seems to be yes. In Chapter 6 of her book, Miller introduces the reader to Lori and Paul. Paul had battered and sexually abused his wife Lori throughout their 10-year marriage and was sentenced to 15 years in prison for raping her at knife point. Paul exhibited most of the typical characteristics of domestic abusers. He was very jealous and controlling and viewed his wife and children as possessions. Paul frequently watched pornography in front of his children and molested his daughter Anna from the time she was 4 years old until she was 9. Upon learning this, Lori took her 2 children and left the relationship. She secured a protection from abuse order, which gave her the right to live in the house with her children without Paul. Paul would later accept a plea bargain and receive 15 years in prison. One of the conditions of Paul's sentence was that he have no contact with Lori or her family or any child under the age of 18. Meanwhile, Lori discovered that she was pregnant from the rape that resulted in her near death and her husband's incarceration. Years after Paul was sent to prison, Lori contacted Victims' Voices Heard. She wanted Paul to admit that he had molested their daughter Anna. Paul was not serving time on charges of incest. Lori also wanted Paul to see her as the more confident person she had become. The Victims' Voices Heard program bought Lori a new outfit and paid to have her hair done professionally. For the first time, Lori looked how she felt, in charge of her life. During the meeting, Paul took responsibility for harming their daughter Anna. He also offered his assurances that if he was ever released from prison, he would make no attempt to locate either Lori or their children. And Paul revealed several instances of sexual abuse he endured as a child. For example, during the meeting, he claimed that he was raped by a teacher at the age of 14. Later, Lori watched a videotape of her face-to-face meeting with Paul. She felt empowered. After reading about Lori and Paul's face-to-face dialogue, do you feel as though it was appropriate for them to meet through the Victims' Voices Heard program? Many scholars have criticized the use of restorative justice for domestic violence victims and their offenders. For example, what if the batterer uses the face-to-face meeting to reassert well-honed power and control tactics? And what if these tactics are so subtle that the batterer is able to antagonize his victim openly in the presence of others without anyone but the victim realizing that the abuse is taking place? And do all offenders truly have an ability to feel empathy? What might be some other reasons as to why a domestic abuser such as Paul may have been willing to meet with his ex-wife and victim? Are there any type of precautions that can be taken in order to ensure that a face-to-face meeting between a domestic batterer and victim will go smoothly? If so, what? Think about these questions as you continue reading Miller's book. Next, let us turn our attention to another face-to-face dialogue involving a domestic abuser and his victim. This dialogue occurred between Melissa and Stephen. Melissa was sexually molested by her father, Stephen, from the age of 10 until she was 15 years old. Stephen was given a prison sentence of 17 years. Several years later, at the age of 22, Melissa sought out the Victims' Voices Heard program in order to participate in a face-to-face dialogue with her estranged father. In order to collect data for the book, Susan Miller would later interview both Melissa and Stephen. However, the author did not view the videotape of the face-to-face dialogue between the two. In the book, it is evident that Stephen was extremely manipulative, which is quite common with the majority of sexual offenders. He tried to normalize the incest by telling Melissa it was totally appropriate for such intimacy to occur between a father and a daughter. Melissa initially directed her anger at her mother rather than at her father, which is consistent with research that shows that children who are incest victims often blame the parent who has the least amount of power in the household for failing to protect them, as opposed to blaming the powerful abusing parent. Melissa had tremendous feelings of helplessness and even guilt as a result of the prolonged sexual abuse. Her helplessness made her feel as though she was partially responsible for the abuse, and this guilt was reinforced even into her adulthood when people, such as her husband and other family members, asked Melissa why she did not say anything about Stephen's behavior while the abuse was ongoing. Both Melissa and Stephen spent months preparing themselves before the face-to-face dialogue occurred. They each completed homework assignments. At times it was painful for both parties to dredge up memories of the abuse, yet this was a very necessary step toward ensuring that a successful meeting would occur. Also, these homework assignments would help determine whether or not Stephen was prepared to accept the guilt. Typically, many sexual offenders have ways of rationalizing or minimalizing their deviant behaviors. If the meeting was going to happen, it needed to be clear that Stephen would accept responsibility. Otherwise, things could quickly go from bad to worse. Fortunately, the meeting went well. Melissa no longer has nightmares or problems sleeping. Nevertheless, in her book, Miller points out that Stephen did make a few attempts to minimize his abusive behavior. Though Miller did not actually see the videotape dialogue between Melissa and Stephen, she was told that Stephen on some level tried to justify the abuse. For example, he claimed that at the time of the abuse, he believed that sexual contact with his daughter would bring them closer together and help him to actually help her be more obedient in school and keep her from breaking rules. Stephen also stated that he took pride in the fact that he was the one who recognized that the abuse was wrong and decided to stop it. Also, while he conceded that his actions were inappropriate, he argued that it would have been much worse if it had progressed to actual intercourse. Because there was no sexual intercourse, Stephen believed his sentence was too harsh. After the meeting, Stephen made a comment that was rather disconcerting, to say the least. He stated that some offenders might take advantage of programs such as Victims' Voices Heard by using this as an opportunity to try to control their family member. It is alarming that Stephen acknowledges the possibility that offenders who hurt their own family members would be eager for a face-to-face meeting so they could continue their control. Stephen characterized his participation as a selfless act. But was it truly a selfless act? Can sexual offenders truly develop empathy for their victims? Did the program provide Melissa with an opportunity to confront her father? Next, Miller points to a case where a father, Scott, had a face-to-face meeting with his estranged father-in-law, Bruce. Bruce had sexually molested Scott's daughter when she was only 12 years old. This is another example where Victims' Voices Heard has been used in a case of domestic abuse, this time between a grandfather and a granddaughter. As you read through this chapter, try to see how Bruce rationalized sexually abusing his granddaughter. Also, it is clear that Bruce was not only a sex offender, but a master manipulator. Even before the face-to-face meeting, It was evident that Bruce might try to turn this dialogue into a pity party by lamenting the fact that he was ostracized from his family and had poor health. Can offenders who are so manipulative and self-absorbed actually be able to empathize with their victim? What do you suppose would be some of the challenges in setting up a meeting of this nature? And do you find it curious that the actual victim was not present in this face-to-face dialogue? Should a victim's family member be permitted to establish a face-to-face dialogue with an offender, even if he or she was not directly victimized by this person? These are difficult questions, and there is certainly likely to be disagreement. As you continue reading Susan Miller's book, After the Crime, you will see that the author discusses how victim-offender dialogues are used in other crimes, such as drunk driving, resulting in deaths. 2 of these cases are included in the book. Examine the similarities and differences. Do you think both dialogues were healing? Was there anything that you would do differently if you were facilitating these face-to-face meetings? Really try to examine each case and ask yourself these questions as you read and reflect upon the preceding chapters. Restorative justice programs seek to address victims' needs and facilitate offender responsibility. Do you believe there is a value to victim-offender dialogues? Should offenders be given any credit, such as a reduced sentence or consideration for early release, if it can be shown that they are helping their victims heal? Or do they owe this to their victims? Next week, we will conclude our discussion of After the Crime and shall try to answer these, among other important questions.